Hello and welcome back to Tongue-Tied Tales, a podcast which tells untold stories from the English language teaching world. My name is Richard, and here in episode 3 we will continue with the Japanese tale of Nozu, Nova and me. Last episode saw me arrive in Japan at the age of 21 in 2003 to start to teach English for Japan's biggest language academy, Nova. I talked about my first month or so in Japan and then went a little further back in time to the 1970s to look at the life of Nova founder, Chairman Nozu Musashi, or Nozu, who as a young Japanese man went to France to study and likely fail in physics. However, his language learning experiences in Europe were to lead him to become something of a visionary for education in Japan, at least before his downfall. In this episode we will look at Nozu's early career journey in Japan as he builds his Ekaiwa empire and some secret love hotel style rooms in the company headquarters. The focus here will be mostly on Nozu and Nova's story rather than mine, so it's a bit more historical with less impressions of my grannies. So let's pick up where we left off with the young Nozu returning from Europe to his hometown of Osaka in the late 1970s. When Nozu finally returned home after years in Europe, his schoolteacher parents likely asked him about his future plans. Japan's economy was booming, much to the envy of the rest of the world, and like most young Japanese men at the time, he would be expected to get a respectable job with a good company and by doing so become a salaryman or salaryman. The salarymen were a grey and black suited horde who were everywhere you looked in Japan's bigger cities. They usually worked ungodly hours and remained loyal to one company their entire working life. But Nozu had no desire to suffer from karoshi, a common Japanese term which means death by overwork, and which has spawned video games like Suicide Salarymen. Instead, Nozu sidestepped karoshi with his choice, which was to live without a steady job for several years in central Osaka while hanging out and partying plenty with Western backpacker friends. Sure, Nozu liked to have a good time, and Osaka was famous for good food and good fun, but even as he enjoyed his time, Nozu was watching his Western friends teaching English privately to Japanese students with increasing interest. They were making good money. Nozu became close to two Western teachers in particular, one from Sweden and the other from Canada. Both were young recent graduates, and Nozu saw how young Japanese people were flocking to his two friends for English lessons, and how the gaijin, or foreigner teachers, were seen almost like superstars and put on a pedestal. It was a good time to be visibly foreign in Japan, and white and black travellers were often able to make easy money as unqualified English teachers. His two friends were full of enthusiasm for teaching in the dynamic modern ways Nozu had himself experienced recently in Denmark. Before long, ideas began to form in Nozu's mind about opening his own English academy in Japan, and he began to discuss them more and more with his two gaijin friends. They knew the Japanese school system was churning out graduates who could not speak English. The government was aware of this and trying to change things with what would later become the JET program, or Japan Exchange and Teaching Program, which would place native English speakers into Japanese schools. But the reform was limited for now, and any meaningful educational reform would take a long time. Another factor in Nozu's favour was that Japan was very close to immigration, and still is, and this left many Japanese people with a strong desire to explore outside of their own culture from within. An English language and Western culture was seen positively. American culture, whether through baseball or Hollywood movies, had become more and more in vogue since the war. Nozu and his two friends saw a big opportunity to launch their own English language academy, or Ekaiwa, but there was already a lot of competition. They had to find a way to make their own Ekaiwa more unique, cool and sexy than the others. Nozu, having lived outside Japan learning languages, was in the best position, perhaps, to do just that. and so, with him as the CEO, the three men from Japan, Canada and Sweden founded Nova in August 1981, and its first branch opened in the central Shinsabashi district of Nozu's native Osaka. Nozu had chosen the name Nova, meaning stellar explosion, feeling it would appeal to Japanese people. Nozu and his team established and patented what he called the Nova system concept in the classroom. This way of teaching was heavily inspired by the natural or direct method of teaching a language, where you speak only in the taught language using an inductive way to teach grammar, as I mentioned last time, with learners discovering the rules for themselves. And so we Nova teachers had to act out the vocab or use pictures, as most of us didn't speak Japanese anyway. The method could be a lot of fun and effective if done the right way. Nova's methodology also still had some more traditional listen and repeat style activities used to perfect pronunciation and some grammar drills. But I felt this was appreciated by students, as Nozu perhaps wisely knew well enough not to be too out there and to still keep some of the traditional ways Japanese were used to learning languages with at school. Nova's group sizes were also small, at no more than 4, to ensure students got to speak English as much as possible while benefiting from their teachers' full attention in personalised lessons. The lessons could become very personal and interesting, but more on that later. For now I want to continue explaining what made Nova so successful in its early years. The teaching material we use was taken largely from an unpretentious American textbook series called Quest. We made a quick plan before each lesson, and then notes were taken in each student's file after every class to make sure we didn't repeat any material unless the student needed to. Once they mastered a level of Quest, students then progressed on to the next level. As a Nova teacher myself, I felt it was a simple and effective system. New students walked in, their English was assessed, and they were given a level. They could then book lessons at any time of day or night to suit their own timetable, and Nova Ekaiwas were open from early to late 7 days a week. Students were put into random groups unless they booked with a friend, but they were always put with people of a similar English level, so elementary or advanced. I like this constantly changing and fresh makeup of the classes, which was so unlike a traditional school. A lot of the students did too, and it meant we all met a lot of new people. Beyond the classroom, Nova's branding and image were also instrumental in its early success. Nozu instinctively knew what would appeal to his target audience, the Japanese, more than any foreign language teacher could have. One thing he saw was that Japanese anime was becoming hugely popular in the early 1980s. He took full advantage of this to design Nova's company mascot, Nova Usagi, a strutting pink anime rabbit who remains well known to this day in Japan. With an enthusiastic and young management team behind him, Nozu recruited more young and attractive Western teachers, getting them all to dress smart in business attire. Behind the scenes, there was also a growing and dedicated Japanese administrative team pushing expansion and sales. Nova was sexy and cool, and it started to open new branches faster and faster. By 1991, Nova had a presence in all 47 Japanese prefectures, which are the subdivisions of its 9 major regions. Nova and Nozu were riding a huge wave of success, and journalists were hailing Nozu as a great businessman and leader. These were heady times, and in the early years the management and Nozu could be found celebrating with staff and teachers at wild company parties that could last for days. And the early Nova teachers were often treated like VIPs being chauffeured around. But the relationship between the Nova management and many teachers began to sour as the company grew. There were some negative stories and feelings about Nova in Japan, as quite a few Japanese Nova students and Western teachers were getting too publicly involved. Some women got pregnant, and the male teachers fled back to their home countries. While there were many Nova love stories and friendships between students and teachers that were nothing scandalous, it was just too much for some more conservative elements of Japanese society. Just what was Nozu doing letting all these Baka-gaijin, crazy foreigners, into their country? Japan was a socially conservative place with very low immigration, as I said before, and Nova had fast become the largest employer of foreigners in the country. Nozu and Nova responded to teachers being too friendly in the classroom by implementing a strict no fraternization rule whereby foreign employees were prohibited to participate in any interaction with the clients of the employer outside of the place of employment according to their contracts. This policy led to bitter court cases against Nova, as there were many teachers and students who enjoyed perfectly legitimate friendships outside the classroom. In one case, 6 instructors were fired by Nova for meeting students outside of work at a barbecue or something, and this led 2 Osaka instructors to file a case against Nova saying the policy was not only unfair but racist against foreigners, as it didn't target the Japanese staff in the company. The Osaka Bar Association eventually took the teachers' side, but only issued a non-binding recommendation that said Nova should drop their non-fraternization policy, while commenting that it was unfair to foreign teachers and discriminatory as it did not apply for Japanese staff. In my time at Nova, Dagger, the Tasmanian teacher whose job I took over in the last episode, was one of the victims of this no fraternization policy. Like many of them, he was a victim of his own popularity. In the small town in which I work, this charismatic, fun-loving man was seen as a threat by some other staff at the academy and was pushed out. They all filed reports against him. This happened a lot, sadly, whereby jealousy motivated some teachers to report on others. Thankfully, in Dagger's case, he bounced back, and to this day in 2024 can be found in a small unofficial drinking den in Tsuyama with a very long beard, enjoying life as a university English professor. But this was no thanks to Nova, who seemed set against foreign teachers having the same rights or treatment as ordinary Japanese. Another such right was being able to join a workers' union. While Nova didn't oppose this officially, there are many reported cases of management figures, both Western and Japanese, intimidating any teacher who tried to join a union, and they would typically be passed over for any promotion within the company and hounded out eventually. Nova didn't want their teachers to become too clued up on labour law or the company's inner workings. Now, I don't want to report false rumours in my podcast, but we are starting a part of the tale where Nozu and Nova's reputations go down quite a bit. While there are many facts to tell the tale with, I will be clear when I am speculating, like with my fictional story in episode 2. As while it's difficult to put your finger on, it's probably around this point in the early 1990s that something started to change in Nozu. As a student in Europe and over Nova's early years, you can sense a genuine desire to help his fellow countrymen and women learn English, which stem from his own feelings of loneliness in Europe when he couldn't easily communicate in other languages to make friends. Now, that young and visionary man was a very wealthy and powerful figure in Japan. He had started to take himself more seriously, and all the Japanese business Superman headlines perhaps were going to his head. He was distancing himself more and more from his employees. I know many ex-Nova teachers will say I have been far too kind to Chairman Nozumu's legacy so far, so here is where I put the boot in a bit. As how was it fair that a man who prohibited his teachers to meet with students build a secret red-carpeted suite for himself on the 20th floor of Nova's Osaka HQ, of course with company profits? Allegedly, numerous female Nova staff were invited to Nozu's private quarters, which included a dining room, sauna room, tea room, and another room with a double bed. Now, I am not saying Nozu should not be able to enjoy his success, but it would later be found he was using money officially put aside by Nova for employee benefits or support programs for his own use. It was around the early 1990s that Nova and Nozu founded GigaNet as a subsidiary of the Nova Corporation to provide internet-related services and products. There is some evidence and many more stories about how funds allocated to GigaNet and other Nova companies were misused or diverted for purposes completely unrelated to their intended activities. This included using company funds for personal expenses, luxury items, or investments unrelated to Nova's core operations. Nozu and his partners held things together though, and the company continued to expand and market itself very aggressively over the 1990s, even if the trust between the Nova teachers and the Nova management was fading. Nova would simply fly in plane load after plane load of fresh young Western graduates as fast as the old ones could quit their jobs. Perhaps more worryingly, Japanese Nova students were starting to become upset over Nova's underhand sales tactics. This included misleading claims about the effectiveness of Nova's teaching methods, the availability of classes, or the qualifications of instructors. There were hidden fees and outright lies about how expensive lesson packages worked. Students found out later that their teachers often had no qualifications and were just suited up kids out to party in Tokyo in some cases. Many also found themselves unable to spend their lesson tokens before they ran out due to a lack of available times. Complaints and court cases were starting to become a thing for Nova. But for now, in the 1990s, things were under control as the new millennium approached. Brand Usagi soldiered on, but growing managerial corruption, reckless expansion and a controlling company culture were starting to take their toll. Join me next episode as the story of Nova, Nozu and me reaches its conclusion, and Nova reaches its peak and also a sudden end with teachers, Nova staff, students, the Japanese Yakuza and the police all chasing down Nozu. I will also talk about my own experiences teaching for Nova in the early noughties, how I barely survived scissor attacks in kids' classes, walked for miles in the snow for unrequited love, and generally failed to live up to the Westerner-inspired comic book hero Charisma Man.